The morning after Doris Ketchum died, somebody from the HOA taped a violation notice to her front door. Yellow paper, black ink, the kind of thing that looks like it was printed by someone who enjoys printing things. The notice cited Section 4.12 of the amended covenants, improper storage of waste receptacles visible from the street. Her trash cans were at the curb. It was a Tuesday. Tuesday was trash day. I know this because I'm the one who found the notice when I went over to water her plants. Doris had asked me to do that 3 weeks earlier when she went into the hospital the last time. She didn't say it was the last time. She said, "Margaret, the ferns will die before I get back if you don't give them a reason to live." That was how she talked. Like everything, Green was just waiting for permission. Doris had lived on Sycamore Court for 31 years. She'd moved in when the development was still a cut cornfield with orange flags marking where the sidewalks would go. She told me once that she watched them pour the foundation of her house and thought it looked like a wound in the earth. And then she lived in that wound for 3 decades and made it bloom. Her garden was the kind of thing people slowed their cars to look at. Not showy, just right. Lavender along the walk, knockout roses by the mailbox, a Japanese maple in the front that turned the color of a good Merlot every October. The HOA had never once thanked her for any of it, but they had, over the years, cited her for a garden hose left out overnight, for a bird feeder that exceeded the approved height for decorative lawn fixtures, and for the color of her replacement mailbox post, which was toasted almond instead of the approved desert khaki. If you think those are the same color, you would be wrong according to Gerald Pincher, who was then and remained the president of the Sycamore Downs Homeowners Association. Gerald had held that position for 9 years. He had run unopposed for the last 6 because nobody else wanted the job, and because the 2 people who had wanted it before, that moved away. One of them told me at their going-away cookout that she would rather commute 40 minutes each way than serve on another committee with Gerald Pincher. She said this while eating a hot dog, very calmly, like she was reporting the weather. So the notice was on Doris's door, and Doris was at the funeral home on Broad Street being prepared for a service that Saturday, and I stood on her porch holding a watering can and reading about her trash cans, and I felt something settle in my chest like a coal that someone had blown on. I should tell you what I did for a living before I retired. I was a compliance auditor for the State Comptroller's Office for 27 years. What that means is I read bylaws and charters and articles of incorporation the way some people read novels. I read them in bed. I read them at lunch. I found errors the way a dentist finds cavities. Not with pleasure exactly, but with a professional certainty that the error was always there, waiting for someone careful enough to notice. I had never read the Sycamore Downs HOA governing documents all the way through. I'd skimmed them when Ray and I bought the house. Ray handled most of it. Ray had been dead 4 years by then, and I had been mostly keeping to myself, watering my own plants and Doris's plants, and not bothering anyone. But I took that yellow notice off her door, and I folded it, and I put it in my pocket, and I went home, and I pulled the HOA welcome binder off the shelf in the office closet, where it had been sitting since 2014. I sat down at the kitchen table. I started reading. The first one showed up on a Tuesday, which Marlene always said was the ugliest day of the week. Not bad enough to complain about like Monday, not close enough to anything worth looking forward to, just a nothing day, a Tuesday day. And there he was, standing at the end of her driveway in a polo shirt the color of an unripe banana, holding a clipboard like it was a hymnal. She watched him from behind the kitchen curtain, coffee going cold in her hand. He didn't knock, didn't come to the door, just stood there writing things down and looking at her house the way a dentist looks at an X-ray, already composing the bad news. His name, she'd learn later, was Dale Frick, Vice President of the Cedarwood Bluffs Homeowners Association, a title he carried like it had been bestowed by the governor. Dale had a way of standing that suggested he'd practiced it in a mirror, feet apart, shoulders back, clipboard angled just so, like he wanted you to see he was holding it, but not what was written on it. Marlene had lived in this house for 31 years. She buried her husband from this house, raised 2 kids who now lived in other time zones, replaced the roof twice, the water heater 3 times, and every last inch of copper pipe after the freeze of '09. She knew every crack in the foundation the way you know the lines on your own palm. And she had never, not once, had anyone stand in her driveway and take notes. She went out. "Help you with something?" Dale looked up like he was surprised to find a person living inside the house he was inspecting. "Mrs. Kovac, depends on who's asking." He introduced himself. He explained that the HOA had recently undertaken a comprehensive property standards review. He used the word comprehensive 3 times in 2 minutes, which Marlene thought was a lot even for a man with a clipboard. He said there had been some concerns raised. He did not say by whom. Concerns about what? He consulted his clipboard. The fence along the east side was 4 inches above the approved height. The mailbox post showed signs of weathering inconsistent with community standards. There was a decorative garden flag, the one with the cardinals that John had given her the Christmas before she passed, that had not been submitted for architectural review. Marlene listened to all of it. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do with a man like Dale Frick was interrupt him. You let him talk. You let him lay it all out on the table like he was dealing cards. And then you picked up your hand and you looked at it, and you decided what you were holding. "You done?" she said. Dale smiled the way people smile when they think patience is the same thing as weakness. "I'll have the formal notice sent over. You'll have 30 days to bring everything into compliance." He left. Marlene stood in her driveway and watched his sedan roll down Cedarwood Lane like a slow grey cloud. Then she went back inside, poured her cold coffee down the sink, and made a fresh cup. She sat at the kitchen table where she'd sat 10,000 mornings before. The cardinal flag moved gently outside the window. She could see the fence Dale had measured, the mailbox post he'd condemned. 31 years of living pressed against the walls of this house like water behind a dam. What Dale Frick did not know, what nobody on that board knew, because nobody had ever thought to ask, was what Marlene Kovac had done for a living before she retired, where she had worked, what she had spent 26 years learning to do with a level of precision that men like Dale could not begin to imagine. But they would. She opened the junk drawer and pulled out a yellow legal pad. She uncapped a pen, and she began to write. The thing about old houses is they keep secrets the way old people do. Not out of malice, but out of habit. You live somewhere long enough. You stop noticing what's underneath. Margaret Calloway had lived at 414 Sycamore for 31 years and never once pulled up the linoleum in the kitchen. Why would she? It held. But after the second fine, this one for unapproved exterior paint deviation, which was rich considering she hadn't painted anything since 2019, she started looking at her house differently, not as a home but as evidence. And evidence, she was learning, lived in the places you forgot to check. It was her nephew, Deshaun, who suggested the records request. He worked IT for the county assessor's office, not a lawyer, not anyone important in the way the HOA board would have recognized as a threat. But he knew where files lived. He knew that Ridgecrest Estates Homeowners Association had been incorporated in 1993, and that incorporation meant paperwork. And paperwork meant a paper trail. And a paper trail meant somebody somewhere had written down the rules before Gerald Kettering decided he was the rules. The first batch came back on a Tuesday. Deshaun brought them over in a banker's box he'd gotten from the recycling bin at work. And they sat at Margaret's kitchen table with coffee that was too strong and light coming through the window at that late afternoon angle that makes everything look like a painting of itself. "You're going to want to see page 46, Deshaun said. Page 46 of the original CC and Rs, the real ones, filed with the county, not the photocopied version Gerald handed out at the annual meeting like it was scripture, contained a clause about amendment procedures. Specifically, it required a two-thirds vote of all homeowners, not just those present at a meeting, for any change to enforcement policy or fee structure. Margaret read it twice, then a third time. "He never got two-thirds," she said. It wasn't a question. "He never got two-thirds," Deshawn confirmed. What they found beneath the surface of Ridgecrest Estates was not complicated. It was not a conspiracy. It was something worse. It was laziness dressed up as authority. Gerald Kettering had been president of the board for 9 years. In that time, he had amended the enforcement guidelines 4 times, each time at a meeting attended by no more than 11 of the 43 homeowners. Each time by simple majority of those present. Each time without proper notice as defined by the original documents. The fines were built on sand. Every single one of them. Margaret had paid $640 over the past 2 years in fines she did not owe, for violations defined by amendments that had never been legally adopted, and she was not the only one. Deshawn pulled the HOA's own financial disclosures, which they were required to provide upon written request, though Gerald had ignored Margaret's first 2 letters, and the numbers told a story that was plain enough for anyone sitting at a kitchen table to understand. $43,000 in fines collected over 9 years, exposed aggregate driveways, basketball hoops, paint colors, garden beds, the wrong kind of mailbox post, all of it enforced under rules that didn't exist. Not really, not legally. Margaret set her coffee down and looked at the banker's box like it was something living. "What do we do with this?" she asked. Deshawn leaned back in his chair the way young men do when they're trying to look calm about something that excites them. "We don't do anything yet. We make copies. We make a lot of copies. And then we talk to the Nguyens, because I know for a fact they got fined for their fence last spring, and Mrs. Nguyen is still mad about it." Margaret nodded slowly. Outside, the sycamore tree that gave the street its name moved in a wind she couldn't feel from inside the kitchen. She thought about Gerald Kettering's face at the last board meeting, the way he'd looked at her over his reading glasses like she was a line item. She was going to be more than a line item. The thing about storms in this part of the county is they don't announce themselves the way you'd expect. No dramatic sky darkening, no cinematic roll of thunder across the hills. One minute you're watering the hostas, and the next the air just stops moving, like the whole neighborhood is holding its breath, and then it all comes sideways. That's how Margaret found out about the lien. She was standing in her kitchen, Wednesday morning, coffee going cold on the counter, reading a certified letter that had arrived while she was at her sister's funeral in Dayton. The HOA, specifically Gerald Kipp and the newly reconstituted Architectural Review Subcommittee, had placed a lien on her property for $4,200 in accumulated fines. Unapproved paint color on the mailbox post. Failure to maintain rear drainage grade. Something about the height of her side yard fence that referenced a covenant amendment she'd never seen, dated 3 weeks after Dennis died. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its creases, set it next to her coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table where she and Dennis had eaten 11,000 breakfasts. Now, here's what Gerald didn't know, and what most of the cul-de-sac didn't know either, because Margaret wasn't the kind of person who talked about herself at block parties. Before she retired, before Dennis got sick, before she spent 4 years learning the specific weight of a man who can no longer stand on his own. Margaret Cowell had been a compliance auditor for the State Comptroller's Office. 22 years. She'd untangled municipal bond fraud in 3 counties. She testified before a legislative subcommittee when she was 31 years old and made a roomful of elected officials go quiet. She didn't brag about it. She didn't frame the commendations. She kept a single photo from that period on the hallway shelf, half hidden behind a ceramic owl Dennis had bought at a craft fair, and if you asked about it, she'd say something like, "Oh, that was a long time ago," and offer you a cookie. but the skills don't leave. That's the thing people like Gerald never understand. The skills don't leave. They just go dormant like bulbs in winter, and all they need is a reason. Margaret spent the rest of that Wednesday not on the phone, not crying, not calling her nephew who practiced family law in Columbus. She went to the county recorder's office. She requested the HOA's original articles of incorporation, the CC and Rs as filed, every amendment logged since 1997, and the current registered agent information. The clerk, a young woman named Danielle, who looked like she'd been asked for these documents maybe twice in her career, had to go into a back room for 40 minutes. Margaret waited. She was good at waiting. She'd waited in hospital rooms for test results that took hours. She'd waited for Dennis to recognize her on mornings when the fog in his mind was thick. 40 minutes in a county office with a wobbly plastic chair was nothing. What she found, and she didn't find it that day, it took her until Friday, cross-referencing at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and the reading glasses Dennis used to say made her look like a sexy librarian, was that the amendment Gerald cited for the fence violation had never been properly ratified. The bylaws required a 2/3 vote of all homeowners, not just those present at a meeting. The meeting minutes from that vote showed 14 attendees out of 41 households. Gerald had counted proxies that were never submitted in writing, which the bylaws explicitly required. The lien, in other words, was built on an amendment that didn't legally exist. Margaret didn't smile when she found it. She wasn't that kind of person. She just circled the relevant clause number on her legal pad, drew a small star next to it, and got up to reheat her coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up. The first real storm of the season was moving through, bending the Bradford pears along Thornfield Drive nearly horizontal. Margaret stood at the window and watched them bow. They'd straighten up again. They always did. The thing about living next to water is it teaches you what patience actually costs. Not the greeting card kind. The kind where you watch the bank erode an inch a year and you understand that an inch a year, over enough years, takes your whole yard. Marlene had been watching the Stillwater Creek HOA erode her life, at about that pace since Gerald died. An inch here, the citation for her mailbox post being 3/4 of an inch too short. An inch there, the formal warning about her rain gutters showing oxidation. And then the big one, the one that took a real chunk of bank with it, the lien they tried to place on her house over $1,400 in fines she'd already paid. She'd paid them. She had the cancelled checks. She had the certified mail receipts. She had the bank statements with Stillwater Creek HOA printed right there in the withdrawal column. Neat as anything. But Don Rackley, who had been board president for 11 years and intended to be board president until the sun burned out, said the records didn't show it, said the system didn't show it, said maybe she was confused, maybe Gerald used to handle the finances, maybe she should have someone help her look into it. That was the part that made my jaw tight when she told me. Not the money. The maybe you're confused. The someone help you. Like grief had made her stupid. Like widowhood was a cognitive condition. What Don Rackley did not know, what nobody on that board knew, because Marlene was not the kind of woman who advertised, was that before she married Gerald and moved to this neighborhood and spent 30 years growing roses and keeping her head down, Marlene Kovach had been a forensic accountant for the Ohio Department of Taxation. 16 years, she'd unwound fraud schemes that made $1,400 look like pocket lint. She didn't tell Don any of that. She just said thank you and went home. And then she did what the river does. She started her slow, patient work. She filed her first public records request on a Tuesday, asked for the full financial statements of the HOA going back 5 years, which she was entitled to under state statute as a dues-paying member. The board had 30 days to respond. They took 47. What they sent was incomplete. missing 2 full quarters and all the reserve fund documentation. Marlene noted the violation, filed a second request, asked for the management company contract, the insurance declarations, and the minutes from every board meeting where financial matters were discussed. They sent the minutes with whole sections redacted. Black bars across the numbers, like classified government documents. Like this was the Pentagon and not a subdivision of 140 houses with a shared retention pond. She noted that too. By the third request, Don called her personally, said she was creating an administrative burden, said the board was considering whether her requests constituted harassment, said he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Marlene thanked him for calling, said she appreciated his time, wrote down every word he said in the composition notebook she'd bought at the dollar store, the black and white marbled kind, and noted the date and duration of the call in the margin. She told me all this on my porch on a Thursday evening, the creek making its quiet noise at the bottom of the hill behind our houses. She had the composition notebook on her lap and a glass of iced tea sweating onto my side table, and she was calm the way deep water is calm. I asked her what she thought she'd find. She looked at me over her glasses, and there was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not even determination exactly. More like recognition, like she'd seen the shape of something in those incomplete records, the way a doctor sees a shadow on an X-ray and knows what it means before the test comes back. "Donna," she said, "that reserve fund should have $212,000 in it. I don't think it does." The creek kept talking. Marlene sipped her tea. The crack appeared on a Tuesday, which felt about right. Tuesdays were when the HOA board held their closed sessions, when Marguerite Fawcett sent her violation notices, when the small machinery of petty authority ground its teeth. So it made a kind of poetic sense that the first visible fracture in that machinery would show itself on a Tuesday too. It started with the minutes. Delia had been requesting copies of the board meeting minutes for 11 weeks, not demanding, not threatening, just asking, every Tuesday in writing, with the date and her signature, and a reference to Article 4, Section 3 of the Association's own bylaws, which required that minutes be made available to any homeowner in good standing within 10 business days of a meeting. She had a folder now, 11 requests, 0 responses. What Marguerite did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that Delia had spent 22 years as a compliance auditor for the State Comptroller's Office before she retired and moved into the house on Sycamore with the bad gutters and the garden that made the neighbors slow their cars. 22 years of people telling her records were unavailable, that she didn't have the right form, that the person she needed was out of the office. 22 years of smiling and writing it down and coming back. So when the board's attorney sent a letter stating that meeting minutes were internal documents not subject to homeowner review, Delia didn't argue. She just added the letter to her folder and filed a complaint with the state's Common Interest Community Ombudsman. She included all 11 requests, the attorney's response, a highlighted copy of the bylaws, and a cover letter so clean and professional it could have been framed. The Ombudsman's office called the board within a week. Now here is where the crack became visible, where you could actually see light coming through. Because Marguerite's first instinct was to do what she always did, escalate. She called an emergency session. She drafted a resolution to fine Delia for creating a hostile environment toward the board. She actually used those words, hostile environment, for asking to see minutes. But the board's attorney, who was not a fool even if he had written that letter, told Marguerite something she had never been told in 4 years of running Ridgeline Estates, like her personal fiefdom. He told her no. He told her the ombudsman complaint was legitimate, the fine would be indefensible, and that if she proceeded, the association's liability insurance might not cover what came next. Marguerite proceeded anyway. She sent the fine. $250 for conduct detrimental to community harmony. Delia paid it. She paid it the same day, by check, with a memo line that read, "Under protest, see attached." The attachment was a 3-page letter documenting every procedural violation the board had committed in the past 18 months. Not allegations. Documentation. Dates, amounts, names, bylaw citations. The missing minutes were just the beginning. There were contracts awarded without competitive bids, reserve fund transfers with no recorded votes, an entire roof replacement on the clubhouse that appeared in no budget Delia could find, though the assessment for it had certainly appeared on everyone's quarterly statement. She sent copies to every homeowner in the association. 47 houses. 47 envelopes, hand-addressed, stamped with those little flag stamps you get at the post office. I know because I got one. I sat on my porch and read it twice. And then I called Ray Westbrook, across the street, and he had read his too, and we just sat there on the phone not saying much, the way you do when someone finally puts words to the thing you have been feeling in your chest for years. The Tuesday after that, for the first time anyone could remember, more than 4 people showed up to the board's open session. There were 31 of us. Marguerite sat at the front table with her reading glasses on and her agenda printed in 14-point font, and she looked at us the way glass looks at a stone, knowing what comes next, but unable to move. The morning after the board voted to fine Margaret Huang $600 for her pollinator garden, somebody taped a copy of the citation to the community mailbox kiosk. Not Margaret. She was too busy pulling together the kind of quiet, devastating response that only a retired environmental compliance officer with 32 years of federal service knows how to assemble. I found out about the fine the way most of us did. Reggie texted the group chat a photo of the notice with no caption, just 3 fire emojis, which, looking back, was appropriate. The citation read like Gerald Forsyth had written it during a particularly satisfying bowel movement. Non-compliant landscaping. Unapproved plant species. Failure to maintain aesthetic standards, consistent with community guidelines. There was a line in there about visual disruption to neighborhood coherence that I'm pretty sure he copied from a blog post about French formal gardens, because Gerald's own yard looked like a putting green that had given up on joy. Margaret's garden, for the record, was beautiful. Not magazine beautiful, alive beautiful. She'd put it in the spring after Tom died, replacing the lawn section between her front walk and the sidewalk with native milkweed, coneflower, bee balm, and a dozen other species I couldn't name, but the monarchs apparently could. By July it was humming. By August it was the only yard on Sycamore Lane where anything was actually happening. Gerald cited her on September 3rd, gave her 14 days to remove everything and resod. What Gerald did not know, what none of us knew until the October board meeting, was that Margaret had spent those 14 days not ripping out bee balm, but filing. She filed a formal response to the citation. She filed an open records request for every landscaping fine issued in the previous 5 years. She filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding selective enforcement. She requested, in writing, the specific provision of the CC and RS that prohibited native plantings, and when Gerald's response cited Section 4.2.7, all landscaping must be maintained in a manner consistent with community standards. She filed a second request asking for the board's written definition of community standards, which of course did not exist. She also, and this is the part that still makes me smile when I think about it, contacted the county extension office and got a letter confirming that her garden met every requirement of the state's Pollinator Habitat Protection Act, which had gone into effect the previous January and which superseded HOA restrictions on native plantings in residential zones. Gerald did not know about this law. Gerald did not know about most laws. Gerald knew about the warm feeling he got when he held a clipboard and told people their trash cans were visible from the street. At the October meeting, Margaret didn't raise her voice. She brought a manila folder, just one, but thick, and she read her response into the record. She cited statute numbers. She named the dates of her filings. She produced the county letter. She noted that of the 14 landscaping fines issued in the past 5 years, 12 had been against homeowners of color, a fact she presented without commentary but let sit in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Then she asked, very politely, for the board to rescind the fine, issue a written apology, and adopt a formal native plantings policy consistent with state law. Gerald tried to table the motion. Deb Kowalski, who had been on the board for 9 years and had never once voted against Gerald, looked at the folder, looked at Gerald and said, "I think we should vote on this tonight." The fine was rescinded 4-1. Gerald was the one. Margaret's garden is still there. It's dormant now, just brown stems and seed heads, but the structure of it holds through winter. You can see what it was and what it will be again. That's the thing about a garden like that. Even when it looks like nothing, everything is still underneath, waiting. The morning after the board voted to remove Gerald Pruitt, the street was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in years. Not the held breath quiet of someone waiting for a citation to appear on their door. Not the tight-lipped quiet of neighbors who'd learned not to talk to each other about anything that mattered. Just quiet, the kind where you could hear the Hendersons' wind chime 3 houses down and not flinch, wondering if someone was going to file a noise complaint about it. Maren sat on her front porch, with coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching the sun hit the tops of the Bradford pears that Gerald had tried to have removed twice. They were still there. She was still there. The house that Ray built with his own hands 41 years ago was still there, and the lien that Gerald had orchestrated through 2 sham hearings and a forged compliance timeline was not. The county recorder's office had processed the removal yesterday afternoon. She'd driven down and watched them do it. She thought about calling someone to tell, but there wasn't anyone who didn't already know. That was the strange thing about winning something like this. It didn't arrive with trumpets. It arrived with paperwork and a woman behind a counter saying, "You're all clear, Mrs. Calloway," and the specific physical sensation of a knot behind her sternum releasing for the first time in 14 months. Tom Wexler came by around 10. He didn't knock, just walked up and sat in the other chair like he'd been doing it for decades, which he had. He had a manila folder under his arm, but he didn't open it right away. They watched a jogger go by. They watched Mrs. Park across the street deadheading her roses without looking over her shoulder first. State Licensing Board opened a formal inquiry into Pruitt's property management certifications, Tom said, like he was mentioning the weather. Turns out, when you file fraudulent liens using HOA authority you don't actually hold, several agencies get interested at once. Maren nodded. She already knew this. She'd been the one to send the documentation packet. The one who'd spent those weeks at her kitchen table, with Ray's old reading glasses and a highlighter, cross-referencing every bylaw Gerald had cited against the actual recorded covenants. She'd found 11 discrepancies. 11 places where he'd simply invented authority, and no one had checked because no one thought to check, because he spoke with the voice of someone who expected not to be questioned. Janet Mosley wants to run for the open board seat, Tom added. Janet's good. Janet pays attention. She asked if you consider it too. Maren took a sip of her cold coffee and set it down. I've done enough sitting in rooms with people arguing about setback requirements to last me the rest of my natural life. Tom. He laughed. It was a good sound. There hadn't been enough of it on this street. The folder he'd brought contained the final draft of the new transparency bylaws the interim board had adopted. Open meetings, published minutes, mandatory recorded votes for any enforcement action, an appeals process that actually existed in writing instead of in Gerald Pruitt's back pocket. Maren read through it slowly. The way she read everything now, checking each line against what she knew to be true. It was solid. Not perfect, but solid in the way that things built by people who'd learned the hard way tend to be solid, with the cracks sealed from the inside. She set the folder on the table between them and looked out at the street. Ray's rose bushes along the front walk were coming back. She'd cut them hard in the fall, the way he'd taught her, and they'd responded the way living things do when you give them room and don't punish them for growing. "It's a good street," she said. Tom nodded. "It's getting there." The wind chime rang down the block, and neither of them said a word about it.